So we're in chapter 18, and this morning we're just covering the first 11 verses, which is the kind of first portion of the recounting of his time in Corinth, and then we'll go from there. So let me read this morning's text, and then we'll commence our study from there. So, Acts chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. After these things, he departed Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, and his wife Priscilla, who recently came from Italy because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he was staying with them and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade both Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly bearing witness to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a God-fearer, whose house was next to the synagogue. And Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household. Many of the Corinthians also, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you. No man will lay a hand upon you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. And he stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Morning. Come on in. So, we've only just commenced. We're in the beginning of Acts chapter 18, and we're looking at the first 11 verses this morning. So, I'll give you a sec to open up and get settled in. While you do so, let me just cover some details in our last week not that it was recorded, but last week we were back with the visual software looking at Corinth like we did with Athens, and covered a number of the important details about the city. Fascinatingly, as I pointed out when we did it, it was a bit of a unique scenario where the three of us who were actually there had all been to Corinth, which is very, very rare to have that in a Bible study in Australia, on the other side of the world. And we saw a number of the details, particularly around the religious culture of Corinth, the economic, the ritual culture, and everything that was tied in with the significance of Corinth. Corinth was still a very significant city even in this time. It was the capital of the Roman province of Achaia, and was very much a major place politically, economically, socially, and otherwise culturally in the eastern provinces of the empire in these days. And so Paul arrives here from Athens, and that's where we end up picking up here in chapter 18, verse 1. So after these things, he departed, these things referring back to chapter 17, he departed Athens and went to Corinth. We explained in that lesson that we're not sure how he travelled. Travelling via sea would have been the quick way around the island of Salamis. But nonetheless, he arrives in Corinth, and he found there a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. Pontus is, and if you happen to have the maps that we've been using on this second journey, Pontus, the province of Pontus and Bithynia, the Pontus is a description of the Black Sea. So Pontus is used in those references. So the region up along of Anatolia, what today is Turkey, the southern shores, that is to say, then of the Black Sea, is was historically described as the region of Pontus. It was the kingdom of Pontus at one point, etc., etc., etc. It had been Hellenistic for a very long time, even well before the conquest of Alexander the Great. The Greeks had established colonies all around the Black Sea, including all the way up into Crimea and parts that today are territories of Ukraine and Russia.
There are still Greek-speaking Greek speakers, ethnic Greeks in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
Many of them.
Yeah, correct.
And
yeah.
Russia and Romania and Bulgaria. I've met them.
Yeah, exactly. So have I. Yeah. The Greeks colonized much of the Pontus, of the Black Sea, and had many colonies there. The kingdom of Chalcis, which is where the famous story of Jason the Argonaut is set. That's up in Crimea and what today is Russian territory, Georgian territory, I should say. Georgians should hopefully forgive me for saying that. Across in the territories of what would be southern Chechnya and the modern nation state of Georgia. So the Pontus, this is where they're from, and where Aquila's been described as being from, him, a native of Pontus, and his wife Priscilla, who had recently come from Italy because of Claudius, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. So that's a reference to the Jewish expulsion under the Emperor Claudius. Now Claudius reigned from AD 41 to 54. Most historical sources, drawing from sources like Roman historians like Suetonius and other such sources, would highlight that the expulsion probably occurred somewhere between AD 49 and 53. No later than about January of AD 53.
Why?
Why? Because of the timing in which Suetonius ties it to certain events during the reign of Claudius. Other Roman sources, this actually is one of the primary sources for when this occurred.
So the Bible?
Yeah, the Bible here, yeah. So this actually does serve as one of the main pillars of that historical detail, because this says it clearly occurred under Claudius. And it serves as one of the primary evidences that it did occur under Claudius.
The reason why I ask why is because we know from the Bible that the Jews were very careful to maintain peace in whatever city they were in the Roman Empire,
which is why
generally speaking.
Yeah, correct. And that's why this is notable. So Suetonius remarks that, and this is where it becomes interesting, and I'll make a point here because it's worthwhile for history's sake and church history. So Suetonius, as one of the primary one of the best sources on the dating of when this expulsion occurred, explains and summarizes it in one sentence. He talks about it more, but he summarizes it in one sentence by saying that the Jews, being led by a man named Chrestus, had caused an uproar in the city of Rome. Now, etymologically, Chrestus is, and it's complicated, but long story short, Chrestus etymologically in Latin is very similar to the wording for Christos. And so the academic, there is good reason why various historians and scholars academically have said that perhaps what had gone on here is one of the more evident examples of how, because we know that this, what I'm about to say, was a factor. Certainly through the first half and the middle portion of the first century AD, the Romans hadn't really made any distinction between Jews and Christians in any meaningful sense. The Christians, certainly because early on, obviously the bulk proportionally of Christians were ethnically Jewish, they hadn't really made any meaningful distinction between the two groups. The Christians were, and any wording of Christian or that kind of term, which first pops up in Antioch, which we covered back in, I forget what chapter it was, but one of the chapters. The Romans most likely viewed the Christians as kind of a Jewish sect, like the Zealots or like the Sicarii or other such groups like that. But then obviously across the first century, the proportional ratio of Jew and Gentile starts swinging heavily, and so that's where the distinction becomes a lot easier. But if you're talking in and around,
50.
early 49, 50, 51, 52, when this expulsion occurring, roughly speaking, because that's a good ballpark for it. Then at this point, the Romans probably still haven't made any meaningful distinction between the Jews and the Christians, religiously speaking. And so the reference that Suetonius makes to them being led by a man named Chrestus is may well be that what had been occurring was that Christians who had gone to Rome and visited Rome and started doing things in Rome may have been the ones that were actually causing the quote-unquote uproar, not legitimate, not actual literal uproar, but like as far as the Romans were concerned is what I mean. But the Romans haven't made this distinction between Jew and Christian yet, so they just go, it's the Jews, and kick them all out. Yeah, so that's one of the prevailing historical theories, academically.
Yeah, that's according to the best, say.
No, I'm just explaining. I'm just laying out the arguments that are made. Yeah.
Rationalistic, historical. But if we look at it from the spiritual, perhaps the hand of God was over this, because
for sure.
the Romans were tolerant, very tolerant of Judaism.
More so than anyone else.
It depends on the on who was emperor.
Correct. Yeah.
But let's say Claudius.
And that all changed by the time you got to the late 60s.
Let's say Claudius
when Nero died.
was generally tolerant, like his predecessors, so long as the Jews kept the peace.
Basically.
The Romans would not have taken the bold step of expulsion of all Jewry, because that's a big step.
Yeah, correct.
Unless something serious happened politically.
Yeah. It's definitely possible. And so, look, there's no definitive way, because there's not like a wealth of detail about it. We know it happened. That's not debatable. But the motives behind are because the Book of Acts doesn't say why. It just says that it happened. Yeah. It doesn't bother with going into why it happened. It's not, and that's not because that's a lack or a fault. It's just that's not what's in view. Remembering
when Agrippina was Jewish.
Yep.
So, was she the predecessor to Claudius? Yes. Agrippina and her husband.
And her husband, yes. So before Claudius was Tiberius.
Tiberius, okay. So we know that Tiberius and Agrippina were friendly to Jewry.
Well, because of Agrippina, yeah. Correct.
Right. And it's very unlikely that Claudius...
And Agrippa grew up with Claudius.
It's very unlikely that such a bold schism would have taken place between the reign of Tiberius and the reign of Claudius. So something's going on here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's part of that. That is part of, but that's part of why, and it's interesting to think about. That's part of why the Christians actually having been now. When it says the Christians calling uproar, what that means is the Christians saying that Jesus is king, and the Romans taking umbrage to that. That's what that. So, like what Paul said in Athens. So, not actual they were being violent, they were rioting, they were burning Rome to the ground. Unlike that which Nero would go on to accuse them of. After he allowed the city to be burnt, he would then turn around and blame the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, I think it was. But nevertheless, point being, with regards, that's why the thought has been, well, then perhaps because of the very extensive tolerance of Jewry, which was unlike anything else. No one had as much kind of free reign, quote unquote. Still within parameters, but no one had as much free reign as the Jews at all. It wasn't even remotely close. No one. When the Roman conquest of Judea came about through an alliance, not an invasion. The Romans, I believe under Pompey, if I'm not mistaken, were the ones who actually came in to help the Jews overthrow the Seleucid Empire and the rulers of the Seleucids. And so whereas other places in the empire, well, Gaul became Roman because Caesar wiped out 1 million people in the process of conquering. That's how that happened. So different parts, different Roman provinces were typically conquered, and quite brutally. The Judea was a pretty rare exception to that. Yeah, 100% right. And so that's why the hypothesis has been, or the theorization of it has been, that it was actually Christians preaching and teaching that there is a king above Caesar, and that there is only one God, and that then caused, and because they haven't made the distinction between Jew and Christian yet, they've just gone, the Jews are causing a ruckus and So anyway,
if that's the case, then the non-Messianic Jews would so detest the Christian Jews that they would want to kill them.
Yep, and that's why part of the historical academic reasoning has been that's informs, not that it justifies obviously, but that's part of the informing aspect as to why the Jews have been so violent, certainly of recent along this trip. Like this is really through Philippi and Thessaloniki particularly. This is where it has ramped up in notability. It happened back in Derbe and Lystra and other places in Anatolia, so it happened there. But it's continued its way through in very public ways, where they've now been incorporating the magistrates and the wealth. Like we saw that whole corrupt ordeal back up in I believe it was Philippi. It was Philippi with the priestess of Apollo and so on and so forth. Anyway.
I think we're on to the relevant point here, because we'll get to the stage very shortly where Paul says some very interesting things to the Jews.
Okay.
So before we get to what Paul says, the political foundation has to be laid that there is the political and spiritual foundation has to be laid that there is a split between the Jews, the ethnic Jews, and the ethnic Christian Jews, and then the horde of Gentiles that are joining them.
Yeah, correct, yes.
There's clearly, we've come to the stage now where there's an irreconcilable split between them.
Yes, correct. And to the what would the word I'd be looking for? To the sadness of the Christians, because they want their fellow, in terms of especially the Christians who are ethnically Jewish, many of whom are like with Paul, for example, want their fellow countrymen to actually step into the promises made to Abraham, to actually be part of all of that.
They not only want, they're yearning for it. They're grieving over it.
And Paul says it desperately. Yeah, correct. Paul says so elsewhere in his epistles as much. But the reality of what ends up happening is that through the first century, all the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem, probably somewhere in the ballpark, as far as we can tell historically, based on given sources, about a third of the Jews become Christians.
Interesting.
Roughly, there's very rough numbers, but that's as far as we can tell from historical sources, about a third. Josephus tends to lend that view, and there are other sources as well. But about a third. And so the majority join the apostasy that occurs in the first century.
Isn't that interesting? Because in Revelation we're told that 2/3 of world Jewry will expire, perish.
Well, yeah. So we get that's a whole other exegetical thing.
And the Lord works with the nation of Israel. He tends to work in thirds, 2/3. Yeah. In other areas, that's another study.
As well.
Well, I understand that during the German Holocaust, 1/3 of world Jewry died.
About so, yeah, roughly, yeah.
So the next one will be worse, and it will happen.
Very interesting.
It says so.
Very, very interesting. The
numerical, yeah.
The numerics behind it.
Yeah, exactly. So. It's but the point, and then one point you actually touched on was salient. Yeah, it's that already by this point we're in the early 50s. The fissure, the separation between those who have, because this has been going now for 20 years since the resurrection of Christ, roughly, and Stephen and all that jazz. Yeah, it's not since it's been 20-ish years since the resurrection of Christ, and you've got. That's not a short time necessarily in terms of developing things, especially seeing as how far we've reached. We've gone the entire eastern half of the world at this point. The gospel has already arrived. Well, by this time now in the 50s, Thomas has now started already making his way over to India. Matthew has already started making his way down to Ethiopia, which is not just the modern nation state of Ethiopia, but basically south of south of Egypt, anywhere south of Egypt, and so on and so forth. And so this is spreading like wildfire. But point being is that the separation is occurring because the consistent teaching of the apostles and the fact that there's no genuine refutation. The Jews still can't deny that the body is actually, they still can't point to the body. They still can't point to the fact that Jesus did or didn't die. Of course, he clearly did, very publicly. There's no refutation levy. It's one of the single most convincing things. I know I've said this 1,000 times, but I'll say it again. One of the single most convincing things about the historicity, that is to say, the historical truthfulness about what you get in the Gospels and the Book of Acts, is the fact that there are 0 Jewish sources that refute it.
Yes.
There's just simply anger at the fact that they don't like it. There's no refutation.
And a majority of the more than 500 who witnessed Jesus' resurrection and walking through Jerusalem are still alive by this stage.
Yeah, many of them are still alive. Sure. Exactly, 100%. Hundreds of people who saw it are still alive. The apostles plus, yeah.
Remember, the Bible tells us that it's not 500. The wording is not that.
No,
it's
not literally. Yeah.
More than 500.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah. Exactly.
How many?
Exactly. How many? Yeah, exactly. It's only meant to be presented as a rough number. It's like Jesus. Luke explains that Jesus began his ministry around the age of 30. Now, around the age shouldn't be taken as 50, but it doesn't have to be literally on his 30th birthday. No. Mainly because birthdays are a modern invention mainly. But yes, so that's a prevailing thing, and so it's not, and that informs what we then get to read. So if we keep going through, we'll see, and especially by the time we get up to verse 6. So in verse 3, and because he is in referring to Paul was of the same trade as Aquila and Priscilla, he was staying with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. So they found a commonality in that, as in Paul found a commonality with Priscilla and Aquila in regards to their tradesmanship and their craftsmanship. And Paul, because Paul's by himself at this point, because Silas and Timothy haven't come yet. That happens in verse 5 when they come down from Macedonia. And so Paul is needing to provide for himself because he's also the very same man who said, "He who does not work does not eat." And which is a very sound piece of ancient wisdom. Obviously charity is a thoroughly Christian enterprise. Christians have been responsible for the overwhelming majority of charity in history, even to this day. Half of all charities around the world are Christian. So from the one religion, we do more than half of the charitable work. More than half the hospitals built around the world are Christian. More than half the schools built around the world are Christian. So it's the overwhelming disproportional rate of Christian charitable work. Charity coming from the Greek word charis, meaning grace. Charity and Christianity are two sides of the same coin. Yet at the same time, there is balance because charity, even before you get onto the question of ethically, should charity make up for slothfulness? Charity just functionally does not make up for slothfulness. Laziness and a lack of desire to work, a lack of desire to provide for yourself, for your family, for your community, whatever the context happens to be, no amount of charity makes up for that. And societies tend to find themselves in problems when they attempt to substitute honest work, charity and handouts, quote unquote, for honest work. And thus is the rise of the modern welfare state, which not only allows it, but actually ends up incentivizing it, where you can make more money through government programs and receiving money for doing nothing than you can from actually working, at least in basic terms at least. And so that's always a problem. So the point being is that, and the second point here is that he is displaying a principle which, not for everyone, but for the but I would argue probably for the vast majority of ministers is a good idea. Certainly, especially if they have a family, is bivocational, bivocationality. So being bivocational, in other words, you are a minister, but you're also providing for yourself and for your family through another means. Generally speaking, and it's a principle that has been adopted quite regularly. Many ministers throughout the history of the church have adopted that same principle as to what Paul is doing here, where they are providing for themselves. Even during the medieval period, many of the churchmen would actually have side job, quote unquote. They would work in the village. They would, and part of that was always tied in with the charitable work anyway. So there was a flow-on effect. But generally speaking, it's a fairly good idea. But point is here that Paul is doing that in order to provide for himself. He probably also has in mind, by the way, the events that occurred back up in, I think it must have been Thessaloniki. Yeah, it would have been, where Jason, this wealthy man who had converted to Christianity, was providing for Paul and being charitable in that sense, and then Paul has to flee, if you remember, down to the coast because the Jews and the authorities are trying to kill him, and so Jason gets imprisoned. And then we explained that he writes back in Thessalonians and spends a good bulk of the first chapter basically justifying and explaining, rightfully so, that he wasn't there to just take advantage of them. This was a confluence of unfortunate events and all that kind of, because he didn't want them to think that he was just some rabbi who rolled into town and who was teaching some stuff and then just living off the fat of someone else. And so he may very well have that in mind when he's here, because he wasn't doing that up in Thessaloniki. Anyone who reads the text honestly realizes that. But people's perceptions can often be erroneous. So, as he was doing this, in verse 4, he was reasoning in the synagogues every Sabbath, it's every Saturday, trying to persuade both Jews and Greeks. We've seen that line 1,000 times already. And that was his custom according to Luke. So in verse 5, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly bearing witness to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. So he puts the tent making on hold because now the other Christians, his other mates have arrived. They can be focused on the more day-to-day pragmatic functions, and he can now just devote himself straight up to the ministerial side of things. And so it served a purpose. He solemnly bearing witness, and the purpose of that is to solemnly bear witness to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Saviour, he is the King, he is the anointed one who had been so looked forward to, for so long looked forward to in ancient times, and bearing witness to the reality of that. He had seen Jesus raised from the dead. The others that he knows have seen Jesus raised from the dead. He's testifying to what they've seen and how he had fulfilled the various things which had been said about what this one would do for hundreds of years. So then in verse 6, but when they resisted, as in the Jews, when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads, I am clean. From now on I'll go to the Gentiles. Now there's a bit of like rhetoric here which would be very immediately familiar to people in the first century and may not be as much today. So shaking out your garments was an actual visual demonstration, really used as like a figure of speech. You actually literally did the action. It's equivalent to another common ancient Near Eastern practice or custom of brushing the dust off your sandals.
Or throwing shoes at Saddam Hussein.
Yeah,
same thing. Yeah,
same thing. Yeah, the shoes. That's the way that emblem comes on. Yeah, correct. Yeah. So exactly. So throwing, when you've seen, back in the 2000s, where someone would throw a shoe at Saddam Hussein, or when George Bush had one thrown at one time, I think as well. That's a Near Eastern custom that still prevails. Yeah. No, there's actual, there's meaning behind it. Yeah. So it's the same thing here. So shaking out your garment, so shaking out his tunica and what else he would have been wearing, is basically what we would say, and we have other equivalents, where we would say, for example,
I wipe my hands
of this, I brush the dust off my shoulders, that kind of figure. That's what we do, those kinds of things. We tend to say them as figures of speech as opposed to the visual demonstration, but Mediterranean people all around the Mediterranean are much more visual in their remonstrance of their thoughts and their emotions, and so the actual shaking out of the garment was something that was a customary thing that was very well known, and it was basically saying I'm done with you, is essentially what it is, and it was because they had resisted and they blasphemed, so they were probably throwing all kinds of curses at Jesus, no doubt. And so he says to them, your blood be on your own heads. Now it's also important to remember, by the way, very clever wording on Paul's part, because it's a self-condemning statement upon them, because really all he's doing is actually quoting them back to themselves. And if you're not familiar with what I'm referring to, Luke recounts in his gospel that maybe Mark also does too, but I think certainly Luke does. But anyway, when the Jew during the trial of Jesus, Pontius Pilate says that there's no legal basis. I'm paraphrasing, but there's no legal basis under Roman law as to why this man is guilty. Mm-hmm. He's not guilty of having violated any of our laws, and so basically he says to them, this is on you. And so then he does the whole symbolic washing of the hands. Now that doesn't ultimately morally obfuscate him, because Rome's as much a part of the crucifixion. I mean, after all, it is a crucifixion. It's a Roman death penalty that was reserved for the worst of the worst criminals. But the Jews in the crowd, led by the Sanhedrin, say to Pontius Pilate, literally, may the blood of this man be upon our heads and upon our children. Yeah. May the blood of this man be upon our heads and upon our children.
They became prophets.
Oh, they did because they had that judgment hailed down upon them in the destruction of Jerusalem that came upon that very generation.
I shouldn't say they became prophets. More correctly,
quasi-prophets. Yeah.
And more correctly, it's they prophesied correctly.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, they prophesied correctly. Yeah, they said it when they were in the process of murdering the incarnate God, may the blood of this man be upon our heads and upon our children. And God went, okay.
Same here.
Yeah.
It's
terrifying to think. It's terrifying to think
it's
about.
recounting,
and it's entirely on them. Yeah.
Under Pilate.
Exactly.
The same thing happens to Paul.
Yeah. And part of that is, and so him saying your blood be on your own heads, well, he's not saying anything different than they had also done themselves.
Exactly.
They said, may the curse may the blood of this man, because that's how blinded by arrogance and pride they were. So blinded, may the blood of this man be upon our head, because they didn't think there would be any consequences for that at all. And it's not, if they had, hence, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But
there's a very important theological point here, and that is that Paul deems them reprobate and irreconcilable to God the Father and God the Son, and pronounces judgment on them.
Basically, correct, and part of that is, and so there's a whole confluence of things going on there.
Meaning they can't be saved from now on.
Yeah.
That's a serious thing, because how do we determine whether to say to someone, let's say someone's been in this church and departs, and you bump into him in the street and he's blaspheming the name of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I've met people in positions like that in other areas too, yeah.
Do I then, in my own mind and heart, say, oh, well, you're given over, or do I still give room for that soul to repent? Clearly here, Paul does not give further room for repentance.
No, and that's part of the balance of, and it is a balance, but it's a right balance that just has to require context. And so this is where, these are the kinds of contexts in which words like those spoken to the Apostle Peter, for example, upon the right around the time of the Mount, upon the Mount of Transfiguration, where Christ says to Peter, to you I give the keys to the kingdom of heaven, to bind and to loose, and what you bind what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, what you loose on earth will. That the context of that is talking about the keys, open doors. This is talking about entrance into that very kingdom which he's talking about. Because the whole thing there atop the cave of Pan, the gates of the underworld, as the pagans believe it to be, that whole ordeal is Peter first identifying for the first time, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And there's this whole element of Christ and his kingdom and everything caught up there, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against the church, as he's standing literally on top of it, and all the whole thing. There's all kind of things going on there which you could do an entire series on. But the point being is that the concept of binding and loosing and keys and all this kind of this imagery which Jesus is using there is tying into communicating the meaning of the kingdom and of entrance into the kingdom and the barring of the kingdom. And so here, all Paul is doing is actually exercising that very language that Christ himself had spoken to Peter regarding. He's been talking to them, and so we don't know how. At this point, by the time you get to verse 6, we know. Well, if you cast your eyes down further, we know obviously by the time you get to verse 11. Luke tells us how long he stayed in Corinth in total, right? So 18 months, right? A year and 6 months, 18 months, a year and a half. How far along verse 6 is, we're not told. So chronologically, that's because it's not important. It just happens while he's in Corinth. So it's obviously during that 18-month period. But how far up? So how many Sabbaths has he, how many times has he been preaching to the Jews and the Greeks? Is it a couple of weeks? Is it months now? How long has it been? We don't know. So the point being, you assume it's probably in the terms of months, because there's the transition in verse 5 where Silas and Timothy come down from Macedonia. That didn't happen in 5. That wasn't a 5-minute journey. And so you can presume it's at least probably maybe 2, maybe 3 months at the minimum, right? So he's been going at this week after week after week after week, and probably also not just only on a Saturday, but marking them particularly by the Saturdays. And so Paul hasn't been at this for 5 minutes and just quit. No, he's been talking to them over and over and over again. And they have been heartily rejecting and even blaspheming God in the process. So it's not like, oh, Paul had a 5-minute conversation and then just couldn't be bothered anymore. No, there's not. They have blinded themselves. Right? They have allowed themselves to become blinded to the truth.
You could say about them that they have no excuse, because
they've
heard the gospel again and again and again. And
they presumably know the Old Testament, or at least should.
Which really has a modern application to everyone in the world.
Yeah, well, us in the West, in the Western men have no excuse. No.
Doesn't Romans 1 say?
And everyone has no excuse. Yeah, correct.
Everyone has no excuse.
No.
Everyone knows God exists.
No, and Paul says that explicitly. To paraphrase, he says that the truth of God, the things visible and invisible, have been made known through that which has been created. The reality of creation testifies to the need for a creator and all the various things that are tied with that philosophically.
And we know from history, and we particularly know from the letters by Jesus to the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, which are, say, 95 AD.
Depending when you date it, some date it earlier, some date it later. I had the earlier date, but yeah, it depends which one you get. Either way, though, yeah.
So, 40 years after this incident, the Jews referred to in the book of Revelation are still unrepentant. In fact,
whether you take an early date or late date of Revelation, it's still at least, even the early date is nearly 20 years after this, yeah.
Jesus
so 20 or 40 years is still,
the synagogue of Satan.
Correct, and he called, correct.
They profess to be 100%. Jewish, but they have failed to read their own Torah.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
And
they've rejected
identify the Messiah.
Correct, and they've rejected it, and that's why not only Jesus but the apostles use that term. They've rejected the truth. They've rejected that which has been made known, and especially made known unto them, because they're the last people with any excuse. You were the guardians of the words of God. You were the house of the prophets for thousands of years, and you of all people have rejected. You have no excuse. And so instead, though, so it's that at the base root, and then worse because of this, especially in the first century. But these kinds of themes have weaved their way through since. The unholy matrimony that they willfully walked into with regards to the Roman Empire, where they were joined at the hip with Rome. The very mutually beneficial relationship between them and the empire, which we touched on earlier, that's in part why they received such special treatment. And that was true not only just of the common people, but particularly and especially, really, in terms of what's viewed, the civil and religious leadership in Judea. So the Sanhedrin on the religious side, and the Herodian dynasty on the civic side.
Just a point following on from my earlier one, it still for me is highly problematical because I've read about Jews who profess to be, they profess to be Jews, Torah-believing Jews, and then they're converted. They believe in Jesus Christ. That's happened when the Jews have emigrated to the UK,
to the West.
United States of
correct.
America, to Australia, etc.
Correct, yeah.
It's highly problematical for me too, because I know Jews to whom I've tried to evangelise, and I can see a little crowbar kind of getting some space.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give them over. It's not up to me. But theologically, the question, because this is an important issue, I really stress the theology behind it. When do you give someone over to irreconcilability, to reprobate nature? I don't think it's up to man to determine that.
In the ultimate sense, no, because really what Paul's doing, and I've explained this principle before as well, like I explained for the sermon on the weekend, when we were back in Deuteronomy chapter 4, we did the first 8 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 4. And Moses is in power, he's doing multiple things, but part of what he does in that text is he's recounting this tragic, and I explain the context in which I use the word tragic, this tragic event which occurs in Numbers 25, where they're travelling through the land of Moab, and many of the Israelite men, certainly a portion of them, start sleeping with the pagan Moabite women, and the presumption, by the way, is that some of those would have been married. It's part of the text, but anyway, that's a different issue. So they're committing adultery one way or the other, or both, and they're also then worshipping Baal of Peor, one of the local deities, pagan gods, and so all that's tied up in with itself. So and then what happens is that then judgment comes upon them. Justice, they have to face justice. They try to basically throw forth the Moabite women as, it's their fault, they led us astray, they led us into idolatry, which is just then cowardice, so they're just making it worse for themselves, and so they face the death penalty, and rightly so. Now, but the reason I explained this is that it's only modern Westerners who, like, quite frankly, just to be blunt, are just too soft to be able to read that text and go, I have a problem with that. That doesn't sit comfortably with me emotionally. But it's a failure to understand that the death penalty for what occurred there isn't because God's arbitrary, let alone capricious. It's because idolatry brings death anyway. Yes. Okay? When you abandon the worship of God, who is the very source of being and of life and existence, who is actively right now sustaining the universe in its own being, is sustaining every one of us in our being. He's not just merely a God who set things in motion and like a spin top just set it off and then just lets it play out according to natural, because we're not Enlightenment era deists. Instead, God is actually active and proactive in his creation and sustaining and maintaining of all that has been created. He is not just one who created the source of life, he is the source of life and the source of being and existence, in which all things have their existence, including us right at this very moment. And so to cut yourself off from that brings death, naturally. It brings death in itself anyway, because you're severing yourself from the source of life, and death is the opposite of life. Death is the absence of life. The absence of light is darkness. The absence of good is evil, right? We've explained those concepts philosophically before. And so
what you just said definitely applies to the apostate Jews in the time of Numbers,
100% correct,
and the apostate Christians, and
the apostate Jews in the first century.
And a very interesting corollary of that is God's amazing mercy in bringing those lawbreakers we read about in Numbers 25 to justice,
Yep.
they were collected because Moses gave the order to
Yep.
go and
right.
round them up.
Yep.
They knew what was coming to them and upon them.
Yeah.
And what do you think happened as a result? Guess.
Yeah, exactly.
They repented
Yeah.
before being speared through by a javelin.
Yeah, because
They
the
repented.
because the demands of justice were obvious.
They repented. God's amazing mercy. If they hadn't been rounded up, they would have just bopped along in their sinfulness. They would have
Made things worse.
They would have married Moabites and Ammonites and so on and so forth.
They would have proliferated the pagan worship.
They would have just gone on into greater and greater judgment upon themselves by living in sin. However, the Lord brought them to their capital punishment, and they repented before the scaffold, as it were. That has enormous implications for the principle of capital punishment.
I agree 100%. Oh, exactly. Well, and this is part of the point, not that it was the point of the weekend, because that would have been a whole other sermon in itself. When nations abandon the law of God, their laws, we tend to think that their laws would get more draconian. That's not what happens. Their laws get softer, and their judgments get softer. So this country had capital punishment. It started as a penal colony, so that should be obvious. And rightly so. And it wasn't capricious. It wasn't arbitrary. The common kind of trope that people were getting, hanged left, right, and centre for stealing a loaf of bread, that didn't happen. That's not what happened. History is much more detailed and complex than that. But we had capital punishment, and then we started moving away philosophically and theologically from God's law as being the basis of jurisprudence, and our laws have gotten more lax, not stronger. Our judgment, so our justice in the face of evil and of criminality, has gotten weaker, not stronger, because that's what actually happens. You get soft on crime, right, which really is ultimately, at least broadly speaking, getting soft on sin that brings about crime, and therefore you also get soft on punishing those who do evil in society. So you can commit the most egregious crime that you could ever want to do today. You can go full Jeffrey Dahmer. You can kill 20 people, rape them, eat them, all the horrific things that you've seen in serial killers, and you will still have to cross your fingers and hope that they get 25 to life.
Well, it's worse than that, because now
taxpayer funded, where you get to go to a prison and have a TV, a nice bed, plenty of food, even get a job.
Yeah, but there's an army. We employ armies of so-called clinical psychologists.
Oh, yes, correct.
Anthropologists, sociologists, to give an excuse for why the crime was committed in the first place.
Correct, it was your
and what
disease.
is missing from the modern dialectic? The issue of personal accountability.
Correct. Well, I made this point in the last sermon of our series, The Voice of Truth. Not the most recent Sunday, but the Sunday before that, is that the source of humanity's problems are not ultimately systems, because systems are made up of people. People are the problem. Human beings are the problem. We are the problem. You are ultimately accountable for what goes on. It doesn't mean that you can't be the victim of something else, but even when you are the victim of something or someone else, you're actually the victim of someone else who's engaging in evil. So we just circle right back to the personal responsibility element, right? People are responsible. And part of the whole dilemma with the philosophy that is driving the current referendum and the program that's being offered there is the absolute rejection of personal responsibility. And that's not my opinion. The document literally says so. That these issues clearly testify to the structural nature of our problems, as opposed to personal nature. Structural. We are victims of structures, as opposed to we, not only individually but familially and communally, are responsible moral agents in the world. And that this is a testament, or this is the curse, the bane, so it were, this is the torment, is the wording they literally use, of our powerlessness. So if we just have more power, then all these problems, criminality and sin, will get fixed. No. If you repent and you submit to Christ and start following his law and his ethics, then your problems will resolve themselves, because that's how it's always happened. right? And so the personal responsibility element, and so that's why we don't have death penalty. We don't have the death penalty because we've gotten soft on sin and soft on crime. Even the most common things. I mean, there are people who receive less than 10 years for rape in this country. It is the words that I could hurl out here would be unbecoming for this setting.
Do you think, as part of the Zoomer generation, are you Zoomer?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Do you think that your colleagues, as it were, your associates, if they...
My peers.
Your peers, that's the word I'm looking for. If your peers were to, say, go to a public square in the sense of the old-fashioned public square and witness someone being hanged, do you think the crime rate amongst your peers, your generation, would stay stable, increase or decrease?
Oh no, decrease, and that's why capital punishment was always public. And not only was it always public, it should be public. So the way in which even jurisdictions around the West that still have capital punishment, like certain states in America, it's in the prison, and because the Americans actually do have a public criteria. They've just whittled it down to the most minute public criteria of, there's a couple of people watching in the next room. That constitutes public. And we're going to do it and so you're going to have the warden who's on a hotline with the governor in case there's a pardon, and the lawyers there. There's also a representative from the DOJ, from either the state or federal Department of Justice, depending on what level crime it is. And then there are audience members, other particular government officials, and then representatives or people who have been invited who are like a family member or something. That's how public execution, even though it's literally practically in the dungeon of a prison, it's not public. And we're going to do it in the most sentient, humane possible way. No pain, no nothing. And it can also, but then also at the end of the day, the person can actually choose to have the blinds closed for when it happens. So now we've kind of met the public criteria, but not really. It's hiding away. So even the death penalty is like shuffled into this dark corner of like, well, yeah, we technically do it, but we don't really want to, right? That's not how it's done. And that's not how it should be done. Because if you take murder, there's only one just punishment for murder, and that is death. The Bible has no other view of anything else. Because when you have anything less than the death penalty, you're cheapening the value of life. Okay? I can illegally and immorally take your life, and yet I get to live. No, I live in a cage. I live in a prison. But these days, the prisons are better than half the Ibis hotels. And guess who's going to pay for that? Not me. The Australian public.
Yes.
Yeah, but theologically...
Free meals.
The chance of...
Free homes.
The murderer
television.
becoming repentant and being a believer in Jesus Christ is slim. Even though you've got prison ministry, I went to training for prison ministry and found out that essentially you can't take a Bible, you can't preach the Bible. No, because the psychologists. Because then that would be correct, and it's all run through the prism of modern psychological dialectics, which are doing a fantastic job. I mean, look at all the evidence of criminality that's gone way down because of our psychological work, right? He says with sarcasm in his voice. The DSM-5 is just doing a wonderful work in fixing all of our problems. Maybe we should go back to something more grounded in reality than the DSM-5. That would be a nice idea. But anyway, it's justice slips when you abandon the law and the statutes of God. They're serious because these things are serious. And I'll finish on this point and we'll jump back in with regards to what happened in Numbers 25 and then the cross-reference that gets made there in Deuteronomy 4. For anyone who ever thinks, and it's only Western Christians that think this is harsh. Other Christians around the world, in Africa and South America and in Asia, don't think it's harsh because they have a much more grounded perspective on reality. Christians throughout history who have been far more familiar with death and disease and violence than we have also never had a problem with it because they've understood how these things work. But the reality is that
if God doesn't bring justice in the form of the death penalty against those idolaters, here's what happens. They continue to they marry the Moabite women. They have children, and their children's children have children. They not only do they not get rid of, they actually further promote and propagate and celebrate the Moabite pagan culture, which included human sacrifice, which included ritual rape and sex, which included 1,000 different things which are horrific. And now you're going to bring more death and destruction and chaos in the world. But apparently the death penalty all the way back here at the beginning, cutting all of that off, is somehow the thing we're uncomfortable with. No, it's because you lack perspective, and more importantly, you lack a grounded understanding of the seriousness of what was going on there. That's what it is. These things are deadly serious because they are literally deadly serious.
What really grieves me is that if we were to do a straw poll of our leaders, our politicians, hardly anyone would agree with what we've been saying this morning.
Of course not. And you know who also wouldn't agree? Most guys in my position in Western evangelical churches.
Yeah,
in Western evangelical churches, which is half the problem, which is half the reason we're in the problem we're in. I mean, I was having this conversation with someone just the other day. Around the West, broadly speaking, and the Americans are no exception to this. In fact, the Americans are even more so than us. The kind of people who are making laws that are, decriminalising things, decriminalising, petty thefts and other such minor acts, what the Americans would call misdemeanours. What we have here as non-indictable offences. Taking things like murder and other such horrific forms of crime, like rape and other such things, and not having the death penalty for it, but instead giving you maybe 20 years, hopefully. Doing all these other various things, or promoting and not only and protecting legislatively the only form of death penalty we give in this country, which is abortion, and doing everything you can to protect it. Many of those politicians are sitting in churches on a Sunday and are partaking in communion every Sunday. And what on earth are their ministers and churches doing about it? Absolutely jack all. Jack all. And so that's why I've said 1,000 times, and I'll say it 1,001 times. All of this, the culture goes the way of the church goes the way of the pulpit. And it's that simple. It's much more complex than that, but at its basic level, it's that simple. The ills of Western civilization have come about ultimately in terms of the pinpoint of where the epicenter is. It's not the only thing, but it's where the epicenter from which all the other things radiate out. It's the men in my position, it's my fellow ministers in the pulpits who have failed, categorically failed. And I don't make any apology, even remotely, for highlighting that evident historical fact. And so the turnaround begins in the pulpit with actually having men who are vertebrates, who actually have a spine still, to fulfill the position, and then men who actually then have the courage to speak the truth no matter what it costs them or anyone else, because these things are too important. You're talking about the life and death of entire nations and civilizations, because when you allow things to fester and spread across the course of centuries, you're dealing with civilizational scales. It's a really big deal. And if you want an example of what that thing in Numbers 25 looks like, if God hadn't administered justice, by the way, which he already told them about long ago, he already very clearly said the punishment for idolatry is death. No one was under any impression that it was anything else. No one was confused as to what the standards of justice were. They weren't going, "Oh, this isn't fair." Well, of course it's fair. He said this to you like 20 years ago. Of course you knew what it was. But you want to know what it looks like when you don't nip it in the bud? Modern Western civilization. Because we've been developing these problems for like 300 years now, because no one's nipped it in the bud. So anyway, let's circle back to this. Your blood be on your own heads, I am clean. From now on I'll go to the Gentiles. And then verse 7, then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a God-fearer, whose house is next to the synagogue. So he's obviously very clearly not Jewish. He's a God-fearer, so he's like other figures that we've seen, like Cornelius the centurion back in Acts chapter 10. And with a name like Titius or Titus Justus, very clearly a Roman name, and so, but he had obviously been attending synagogue. He had been reading the scriptures. He had been praying to Yahweh, so on and so forth. And he also happened to live next to the synagogue. And so that's the providence of God working, where Paul just literally has to walk next door to keep the enterprise, to keep things rolling. And then to make things even spicier in this story, in verse 8, and Crispus, who was the leader of the synagogue, so would have been chief rabbi, he converts. So the indictment. I mean, this is bordering on Greek comedy at this point. This is almost theatrical in terms of its proverbial screenwriting, so it were. So a wealthy Gentile God-fearer who'd been part of that congregation, part of that synagogue there, there in Corinth, he converts, and therefore, as a result of his conversion, the rest of his household does too, and then also
the neighbour.
Yeah, their neighbour, yeah. And then Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, so the leader of the ones who had been resisting and blaspheming, he then converts. And it's just God going, pluck, boom, and you, and boom. It's just like, this is just, what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost, or it's just, it's the subtle, yet not really actually that subtle, pronouncements of what God's opinion is of what's been going on. You've been rejecting the one who I've sent him to you, a fellow Jew, and you've rejected him. I've sent him to you and you've actually blasphemed me. I'm actually now going to convert your own leader, and now he's going to turn against you, and now he's actually going to come to the truth. It's just like, it's so even your leader, are you going to follow your leader? Oh, and you're going to reject him too, are you? Oh, okay. Like, do you see what I'm saying to you?
That's what happened.
Exactly. Do you know what I'm saying to you? So you rejected your king, Jesus, right, the king of the Jews, and you've rejected this apostle. The
best debater.
Yep, exactly. You reject
theologian.
The best theologian of his generation, and that's like the Jews say that. It's not even just a Christian opinion. Like he was a generational talent. And so I'm going to convert your own local rabbinical leader. Are you also going to reject him too? Well, clearly you are. So you're going to reject everyone that gets sent. You reject me, Jesus. You reject the apostle I send to you, one of the leading rabbis in the world. And then you're going to reject your local rabbi, who also converts to Christianity. Rejection. Like all these, you have to see what's going on here. The cosmic theatre of it all. It's remarkable.
It's no sadder, by the way, that than our fellow Katoombarites or Sydneysiders or Melbourneites.
Our Kadoombans, yeah. Yeah, well, it's the same deal, yeah, in many respects.
Who being constantly fed this lie or that lie, this New Age garbage, this so-called...
This secular atheistic or secular humanist perspective on this and that, and the psychological this and science.
Reject the truth, reject the truth.
Yeah, and worse yet, well, it's actually very much the same. It's just slightly different context. They have thousands of years of biblical history behind them, and they have all the prophets. We have thousands of years of biblical history and all the prophets behind us too. Like, I've had this conversation. The most powerful, and it's not meant to be a trick. It's a legitimate rhetorical device that I use, but it's meant to really be a bit of a sledgehammer to make a point and to hopefully get someone to actually realise the truth of what I'm trying to communicate. One of my go-to routine, in the good positive sense, rhetorical devices that when I'm talking to someone my age, when I'm talking to someone who's Generation Z, so those born in like the mid to late 90s and onward, you are, and this works elsewhere, but it's where I use it, particularly among my own generation. If I'm talking to someone who's generally speaking of Anglo-Celtic ancestry or of European ancestry generally, your ancestors have been Christian for at least 1,000 years, at least. Like the Eastern Slavs, like the Kievan Rus, the Russian, the ancestors of the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Belarusians. That's literally 1000 AD, and they were basically one of the last groups to convert, more or less. at least in terms of their beginning. So your ancestors have been Christian for at least 1,000 years, roughly speaking. What is it that makes you think for some reason that they were all dead wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what is it? Like, what is it that's convinced you that all your ancestors were idiots? Do you understand? Do you understand? Like, what's your excuse here? You have, if we raised your ancestors of the last 1,000 years from the dead, and there would be, like, literally, it's like billions in terms of when you actually cross over, because you have relations that cross over with all kinds of people. But all your people going back to your parents, grandparents, they're all the way back. And we raised all those people from the dead who were overwhelmingly Christian, right? And you stood before them. You wouldn't have a hope of justifying yourself to them. And yet you think you have a hope of justifying yourself to the God who created them? It doesn't make sense. Ethically, philosophically, or otherwise. And so, like, the point I make, and I've had the most times when I've had silence because there's been no response to that has been, and that's not what I'm looking for. I'm actually doing it to challenge their thought and to break down the kind of mental philosophical barriers that they've put up for themselves to try and justify what at the end of the day is just their own immorality, because they'd rather get wasted and get high and waste time and get drunk and do this and do that and sleep around and do all the other trivial things which add nothing meaningful to your life but just give you a dopamine hit. And that's what they've been taught is the meaning of life. Breaking that down is done so by putting things into historical perspective, yeah?
The excuses I get from mainly the Zoomers, but also the guys older than me, the women older than me particularly, they fall into certain categories, but there are two main categories that come to mind. The first one is, the church is highly corrupted.
Yeah, all excuses.
The Roman Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, of course.
The Evangelical Church.
And the Evangelical. Any institution is going to suffer corruption, and we know of the horrible corruption of the papacy. Granted.
Yeah, granted. I'm the first person to say that, yeah.
I have a lot of sympathy for that argument. But that's no excuse not to believe the word of God.
And it's also a nefarious excuse, and here's why.
Sorry, I
thought you were done. Sorry.
The second group are those, especially the youngsters, but also the oldies who say, "Oh, but the Bible has been corrupted down through the ages."
No, no.
Where's your evidence? I say. Where's
no.
your evidence for what you just said? No. What came out of your mouth? Give me some proof that what you say is correct. No. Some evidential basis.
Yeah. None. But it doesn't matter because and the reason why that occurs, well, there's 1,000 reasons why that occurs. The basic philosophical reason as to why that occurs is because it's not actually about the reason. It's just about excuse making.
Exactly.
Right?
It's an easy out.
It's an easy out that's unfathomably and indescribably lazy. The only reason why anyone who hasn't got the letters PhD after their name says that excuse is because they read it on a Facebook post one time. That's why. All it is they read it somewhere and they went, "Oh, that's a good enough excuse for me to use when a Christian actually asks me a question once every blue moon." Right? And all it is attempting to go, "Shut up! I don't want to have a conversation. Just let me keep living my life how I want." That's all it is. It's an unfathomably lazy argument because it's actually not actually a real argument. They're not actually making an argument at all. All it is trying to make small talk to get you to stop talking to them and because now you're making me feel like I'm actually morally accountable for my life because my conscience tells me that anyway. But you have to understand, Christian, that I've been trying to suppress my conscience for decades so that I can just keep living my life however I want. So in other words, stop interrupting the gravy train. The problem is that
they are basically two major answers to the question you put a few moments ago.
Well, sure,
about why have we got here? What has changed?
Yeah, correct.
That's changed. They're not interested. Their hearts have hardened.
No, their hearts have hardened. Yeah, and that occurs over the process of generations. It can occur within just one generation, but it has occurred over the course of generations. What I'm saying. The reason why I made the point about PhDs earlier is because their reasons for such lazy excuses are different. It's also incorrect for the PhDs to do it. The problem is they just do it for different reasons. The PhDs do it for the reason of, and that's why you have You have people who are not Christians. You have people who are atheists who become PhDs in New Testament history.
Why?
Why? Because for
Yes.
for the very same reason. Because they are trying to give themselves an air of believability that go, well, I'm a New Testament scholar. I've got a PhD in New Testament from North Carolina, and so now I'm actually and so I know that the scriptures are a load of baloney. The problem is that you then put them in a room with a Christian PhD New Testament scholar, and you then put them, worse yet, in their worst nightmare of a position, which is in a formal debate, and then they get eaten alive by the Christian PhD, but they don't change their view.
They don't change their view because their tenure depends on it. They want to be controversial. They want to make a name for
because
themselves.
That gets on the New York Times
they
bestseller
want
list.
Power.
Correct,
they want notoriety, and most of all, they want money from sales of their publications.
Hence my point about that's what gets you on the New York Times bestseller list. Yeah, correct. And so the idea of, and that's even circling back to the original root, the original root argument of, Christians, there's so much corruption in the church, as if there's less corruption in your life. What? So that doesn't obfuscate. What I'm trying to point out is just that argument works both ways. So it's actually a moot point. So not an irrelevant point, but a moot point. As in, I'm pointing out the reason why I'm not a Christian is because there's corruption in the church. Now that's about as astute an observation as realizing that the sun rises in the east, because the church is made up of human beings who are morally flawed like other people. So it's demanding a standard of perfection of other people that you don't demand of yourself. Because you're perfectly good and you're perfectly fine with you having done wrong things, but apparently no one else can do anything wrong. So there's already that philosophical, moral, or really in this case it's actually ethical. There's this ethical non sequitur where I'm demanding a level of moral or ethical perfection from someone else that I don't even demand of myself. Okay. And that's why you see that reflected. Now I'll explain in full what I mean by this. Many of these actual studies have been done. The data is fairly conclusive, relatively speaking. The rate of child sexual abuse and the whole hoopla about that in this country among churches is about 5%, which is right around what it is in public society anyway. Okay. Now here's the point I'm trying to make, because this is where people get this twisted. People think that that's me trying to downplay. No, you're missing I'm not trying to downplay at all, because the rate should be 0. But we also live in this world where human beings exist, so the rate's never going to be 0, no matter what I think.
What does 5% mean, though?
Well, correct. It's a lot more complex than that. And so that's where, what does it mean in the broadest sense? It's talking about, that statistical number comes from a confluence of proportions of how many ministers are in different denominations, then in those respective denominations, how many ministers are in a given diocese, depending on what their polity is, be it congregational, Presbyterian or Episcopal.
Sure.
There's a whole tier of how those numbers come out. But
clearly
the point,
it's higher than 5% in, say, the Boston diocese in
yes,
the USA.
It's a proportional number, and so there's all kinds of different things go into it. I'm saying they're averages, but the point I'm trying to make is instead that numbers and the statistics are really secondary arguments, not illegitimate, but they're secondary arguments, because there are deeper theological, ethical, philosophical points of what I just mentioned, which is, there's corruption in this organisation, as if there's not corruption in your own heart. I'm demanding they shouldn't be doing this one. Yeah, but no one thinks that they should be. Well, we don't think that they should be.
That's the issue.
Yeah, that's it. But all you're doing is going, and so really actually what you're doing is you're actually engaging in an exercise of pride, because now you're actually saying, well, there's corruption in the church, not in me though. So I can't join the church because that corruption might spill onto me. You know what I mean? Like it's an exercise in ego of the highest order. And the point is that it also fails to take into account that what on earth has that got to do with the price of tea in China concerning, I'm saying that as a figure of speech, because really what I'm trying to say is moral corruption in a tiny minority proportion of the church. How on earth does that either validate or invalidate whether the Gospels are historically true? It doesn't, right? It would be like someone, right? It would be like, and we would never apply this standard anywhere else, and in fact we don't. If you read a historical biography of, speaking an example, of say of FDR in World War II, right? Or of anything in World War II. You just read a straight up history textbook about World War II. Okay, it's just a normal historical textbook or a biography or whatever the kind of nature of the book is, detailing all the battles and the invasion of Normandy and Operation Overlord and right? Just a normal historical book. And then you find out that one of the editors or one of the principal authors or one of the historical sources was just imprisoned for rape. Does that now somehow mean that his history textbook? Oh, it's invalid. Oh, it's not true. No, this is all fake news. No, we'd never do that. That's a ridiculous argument. So then why do you do it with this? It makes no sense. You see what I'm saying to you? We would never apply that standard to anything else except when people are trying to find any possible excuse to reject this. That's what I mean by being disingenuous. You're not actually arguing or talking in good faith at that point. You're just trying to cut any possible excuse to reject this, just like the Jews are doing here. Christ has, and none of these Jews, every single Jew here would have known full well what happened in the days of Jesus. Some of them may have even been there because they would have come for Passover. So many of the people who are standing here in Corinth would have literally seen Jesus crucified. They also would have been in town for the hoopla that happened on the third day afterward, right? And the uproar that caused, where the tomb was now empty. And everyone knew the tomb was empty, and no one was denying that the tomb was empty, including the Sanhedrin, who knew the tomb wasn't empty, but they rejected it anyway. And then, because you were in town for that, you were there for Passover. You would have been there for Passover because you travel there every year for it. And so you've seen this happen. You've seen it yourselves, at least to one degree or another. You've then also now had Paul, who's also seen it, who's also one of the most respected rabbis in the world at the time. He's come to you and told you what's happened. And then now your own local rabbi has converted and is saying that this is the truth, and your rejection. There's no excuse, right? Just like, I referenced it earlier, but just like you had in Numbers 25 and the cross-reference in Deuteronomy 4, right? God told you, literally decades ago, what the punishment for idolatry would be. No one was under any confusion. He told you, don't sleep with the Moabite women, don't worship false gods, don't do this. It brings death, it brings chaos, it brings degradation and destruction of culture, not flourishing and blessing, right? It brings death, it brings destruction. It will lead you down a path where you'll eventually get to child sacrifice and human sacrifice and all the other horrors of pagan culture, which is exactly what happened, by the way. That's what caused the Babylonian exile, because they eventually got to that point in the 7th century.
You've also described modern Western civilization.
Oh, correct. Oh, look, there's a whole, and I've done it elsewhere, and I would do it. I've written a paper on it before, and I'd love to do it here. This point gets made in Psalm 106, particularly in verses, basically 34 to 37, particularly. Of the description of what I call the five fatal steps with regards to a culture and a people in the face of sin. It begins with pity, so a sin, not just pity generally, because pity can be a good thing, but a sinful kind of pity, pitying that which should not be pitied, right? Sin and evil and chaos and those who do crime, that kind of pity, right? A sinful pity that then moves into tolerance, so tolerating it. Tolerance then moves into compromising with it. Compromising then moves into idolatry, where you're actually now partaking, and the confluence of those four things and the consequence of those four things, by the time you've wheeled your way down the track across the course of usually generations, is it then brings suicide and slavery. When I say slavery, I don't necessarily mean you're enslaved by someone else, although that can happen. It means you've now become a slave to the very thing that you first pitied, then tolerated, then compromised, and now you engage in. Right? Pity, tolerance, compromise, idolatry, or engagement, in other words, and then slavery and cultural suicide, the death of your people. That's exactly what happened to the Israelites. They first pitied, they were told to cross into the land and to drive out the Canaanites, who had child sacrifice, human sacrifice, war, death, chaos.
They pitied the women and the children.
They pitied, yep, correct. And that's what they did, because they pitied the women and the children and the men who were not at the forefront, because they'd taken out the kings, they'd taken out most of the talented, of the good war, of the like the capable warriors, and they left, and they pitied the weak men and the women and the children.
All the intellectuals.
Yeah, they pitied the Canaanite scholars in the ivory tower somewhere. Yeah, they pitied the weak men, and so then they allowed that to remain.
And God said no.
And
No,
God told
don't
them
let any
not.
one of them survive.
Correct.
Kill them all.
Drive them because of the scale of it. I'm saying it comes from a lack of understanding of how evil these cultures were. Like routine child sacrifice, routine human sacrifice, like truly evil things. And they were told to bring justice to that, and against that they didn't. They had pity, a sinful pity, and then they tolerated it. When Joshua passes and divides up the land into the 12 tribes that have all settled now, each tribe's now responsible for its territory, if you recall how Joshua basically fought forth. And basically, your realm, your tribal lands, your responsibility is essentially the principle, right? To summarize. But then many of the tribes, they don't condone it, they don't engage in it, but they begin, after having pitied, or as a result of their sinful pity, to then tolerate it. They allow this little village to remain.
Yes.
They allow this town over here to remain. In their mind, we took out the kings, we took out the warriors. There's no harm over there. Let's just coexist, right? And then tolerance grew into compromise, where you now compromised with it, and you allowed them to flourish, and you took this pluralistic perspective of, well, you have the right to do that that's your right, it's your prerogative. Oh, that's starting to sound like a bit of modern language, isn't it?
That sounds like diversity and equality.
Oh boy, that sounds like diversity and inclusion. Oh boy, that sounds like modern liberalism. That sounds like modern liberal democracy, where we now allow you have the right, and as long as it's in the privacy of your home, or as long as it's among your community. I wouldn't do that, but you have the right to do it.
I identify in the morning as an Australian Aboriginal, and in the evening as
Thank you, Bruce Pascoe.
As an African American. And you better respect me.
And you better respect it and tolerate it, yeah. And everything else is even infinitely worse than those kind of things.
And every Sunday, I identify, and this has happened, a 50-something-year-old man he identifies as a 6-year-old girl.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's happened. There are kinds of trans-ageism and other such things and other such ridiculous philosophical notions. Yeah, correct, exactly. And so all those kind of things, and then even the more egregious or overt, I should say, really the more overt forms of evil, that's among them. And so the pity leads to the tolerance leads to compromising with it, and the compromise eventually leads you into actually engaging in it.
That's what's happened.
We've gone in the span of, that's my point is, we've gone the exact same way that the Israelites went, 100%.
This library of books, called the Bible, is full of accounts
correct.
The Israelites doing their own thing.
Correct, and it caused the Babylonian exile, because really all God was doing was giving them exactly what they've been doing for centuries anyway, which is you've intermarried with the pagans, you've compromised with them. You haven't just compromised with them, you've engaged with them for literally for centuries in many pockets of both the northern and the southern kingdom. You literally have pagan temples like right in the middle of the town.
What really grieves me is the Christian and it's commonplace for a Christian to compartmentalize this book and say,
good choice of words, yes, correct.
It's let's confine it to the Israelite nation.
No, that's just back then. That's that stuff back then, yeah, correct.
Because that doesn't apply to me.
No, correct.
That doesn't apply to the modern church. The Pharisees in Jesus' time, no, they don't exist today, do they? No, of course not.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's a compartment. The operative word is compartmentalization, correct? No, it's not. And I've done this before. This is why I harp on about so much, because I'm trying to draw people's attention to the reality of what we're currently facing. Because without acknowledging and realizing what we're facing, you can't fix a problem without first identifying what the problem is. We have gone the exact same way, almost to the T, as any nation that's ever fell. We are almost, and I mean this, almost to the item itself, engaging in the exact same things that brought down the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. All the kinds of, even things that seem like they might be, uniquely modern, like the various gender identity philosophies. No, that happened in Rome. Transgenderism became a thing in 5th century Rome, right? Rampant sexual perversion of all manners of kind, and not just like sexual perversion general in any sense at all, but like general sexual perversion in a very public, overt way that's then celebrated publicly and becomes like a staple thing in your culture, like as opposed to architecture, as opposed to, academia or sport or the arts. No, like the biggest celebration we're going to have is about who we have sex with. Like that's what I mean. That kind of, that's your defining cultural marker, is like a giant festival about sex. Yeah, that's called the degradation of culture, not the elevation of culture. And so it's very, very self-evident. But in regards to the scriptures, yes, the very same thing, the very same path that the Israelites went down, we are also now going down. And so the thing that has to come into the thought of Western men, and particularly Western Christians, is what on earth is it that makes you think that for some reason we will escape the civilizational consequences when the Israelites didn't, is my question. My question is, particularly to Western leaders, be they Protestant or Roman Catholic, my question would be, what is it that makes you think that God brought down conquest and death and judgment at the hands of the Babylonians upon the Israelites, but for some reason you think we can do the same thing and escape? Why? Why? Because the whole point of, by the time you get to the New Testament, is the fact that the communion with and blessing from God is not actually tied to a special ethnic moniker. The Jews being Jews is not what made them God's people in the specific sense. It's the connection through Abraham and the promises that were made to Abraham. It's the theology. That's what the connection is. And so that's why the nations, by the time you get to the new covenant in Christ, the nations and the blessing of the nations wasn't like some plan B. No, that was always a plan, because he promised to Abraham that through you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, that the justice of God shall flow forth like the waters of like the waters upon the sea, right, into all the earth. That's always been the plan. The nations have always been the plan, the Jews among them, right? And so what is it makes you think that we're going to somehow, we can do the same things that led Israel? Because that's exactly what happened with the Israelites.
You know what makes them think that?
Well, there's 1,000 things, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, arguably there's an overarching thing. Arguably something unprecedented is going on right now that didn't go on with the Assyrians, that didn't go on with the Babylonians, that didn't go on with the Egyptians, neither with the Greeks nor the Romans nor the Jews of the Old Testament. What is that? Something modern is going on that did not go on previously. And that is that all of those cultures I mentioned, whether they liked it or not, acknowledged the existence of God.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
And what
exactly.
do we do out there in the streets?
No, we read, yeah.
On the parliamentary floor, in the media, you name it, in the university faculties. No, there is no God. Secular
humanism, yeah. Secular humanism and atheism, yeah. Yeah. So that is a not strictly unique, but overwhelmingly unique. Yes, that should be fairly self-evident. On one sense, we are actually there is actually a base philosophy in which we are actually doing the same thing that the Israelites did. So, for example, many of the times, and it's very, very evident, especially from the way the prophets speak, many times the prophets will say, especially those of the exilic prophets, the pre-exilic prophets and the exilic prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah particularly, but it occurs elsewhere, but particularly in those three. Daniel also does this as well. But the many times in which the prophets say, and I'm paraphrasing the overarching concept, you Israelites have fallen into a state where you think that merely because you were born an Israelite, that you are somehow going to be perpetually blessed by God because you are the chosen people. Okay, and the prophets dispel that completely. No, your blessings come because God made a promise. That's why. It's not because you are a special individual ethnic group as compared to the nations. Now, the nations have always been the long hope of the promises and the blessings going all the way back even to Adam, right? Going all the way through Noah, all the way down to Abraham, right? And the point that they then make, and that's a common thing the Israelites fall into, is they basically think that because we're Israelites, we can continue to do these things and nothing bad's going to happen to us. Well, they found out the hard way that's not true. They found out the hard way in the Babylonian exile that's not true. And they then had hundreds of years to have learnt from the Babylonian exile, and not only did they not learn, they got worse, right? Until you get down to the first century, where it's a dumpster fire, absolute overwhelming apostasy in the majority sense. And they then face a great and ultimate judgment for that in the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, we fall into the same trap of thinking, well, we in the West have been Christian for at least 1,000 years. Look at, we've risen to the heights of culture. No civilization has reached the same heights of culture and of politics and of religion and of the overall blessings of God than the West. And that's a true statement. Okay? It's an objectively true statement. No one has been wealthier, no one has been more powerful, no one has had higher culture, higher architecture, higher art, higher language, all these kinds of things, higher philosophy, higher academia. No one, right? And that came because Europe was blessed by God.
I know that.
Exactly. But the point I'm trying to make is that we're actually now falling into the same philosophical or theological pitfall of, well, look at the great history of Western civilization. We in the West, we'll never fall under the punishment or the curse of God. So we're actually fallen into the exact same kind of philosophical pitfall that the Israelites fell into in the Old Testament.
Far more sinister.
No, I know it is, but I'm talking at a base level, philosophically.
At a base level, we're rewriting history at university level. Where guilt, we've got this amazing white guilt on our backs suddenly.
Yeah, suddenly.
Because we've ditched God. And now we're saying, oh no, but we, the very culture, the very civilization that you encompassed, have trodden over the indigenous peoples, have
No, we've been horrifically evil, yeah, correct. Yeah.
You see, it's this amazing guilt that when you ditch God, you've got to replace God.
Correct.
And they've replaced God with
nothing. Well, 1,000 things that eventually add up to nothing in their sum total. And this is what Friedrich Nietzsche pointed out. Now Nietzsche contributed to the problem, but Nietzsche at least had the intellectual honesty to realise the logical consequences of his. That's why Nietzsche went insane. Because, well, quite frankly, that's the consequence of atheistic nihilism, is you will go insane, and that's exactly what happened to Nietzsche. But when Nietzsche highlighted probably his most famous phrase, "God is dead and we have killed him." There's a whole that text is much bigger, but and modern atheists have taken that as like a war cry almost. God is dead and we have killed him. But they've actually demonstrated when they do that they've never read Nietzsche, because if they did read Nietzsche, they would realise that Nietzsche was not celebrating that fact. He was highlighting particularly the consequences of the French Revolution, but also the consequences in Europe that came out of the French Revolution over the 100 years between the French Revolution and his time, roughly speaking. And he was highlighting the fact that we have killed God, we have done away with him and his church and all of his things, and it will be the death of us. That's Nietzsche's point. And that's exactly, and Nietzsche went literally insane, right? So Friedrich Nietzsche stands as a warning, almost as I say this inverted commas, like a quasi-Enlightenment era prophet almost, of we have killed God, so God is dead and we have killed him. And he then speaks about the darkness that's going to come as a result of that. And he's saying that at the end of the 1800s. And then it's like a couple of decades before World War I and World War II descend upon the world. Like, it's eerie, dude. And so like these kinds of things are deadly serious, and they come about as a result of the long march of the abandonment of God. Like I've quoted Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Christian author and philosopher who lived under the Soviet Union, who was imprisoned in the Gulag for, I think, about 8 or 10 years roughly, who then eventually flees to the West in the 70s and around 1980. Writes a very, very well-known book called The Gulag Archipelago, which I can recommend to every Christian and to anyone really. But when he's asked point blank in London why did these things in the Soviet Union occur? Why did the Soviets why did the Russians who had a long-standing history of Christianity for, by that point, nearly 1,000 years, 900-ish years roughly speaking, why did they abandon it for Marxist-Leninism, for communism? And his answer was complex, but the simple point of his answer in one sentence, which he said was, men have forgotten God. That is why these things have happened.
Actually, they didn't forget God in Russia because...
Not ultimately, but in terms of forgetting God, what he means is the abandonment of the moral precepts of God that occurred in Russia in the 19th century, yeah.
He doesn't... He's dead now, isn't he?
Yes, he passed away in, I think, 2004 maybe.
We're seeing something very interesting happening in Russia. I, for one, have been rather surprised that Christianity was not stamped out in the Russian...
Correct, yeah.
In the USSR, despite massive efforts by
the biggest efforts ever. No one tried to stamp out Christianity.
Blowing up churches, imprisoning Christians, imprisoning priests,
killing them,
burning Bibles, everything possible to stamp out belief in God, and yet you have this amazing resurgence in Eastern Orthodoxy in Russia in the last 15, 20 years.
Correct.
Mind-boggling.
Yep. And Eastern Orthodoxy is going fairly solid in Russia. It's also Protestantism is also in Russia, and that's increasing and growing, and a pretty good solid form of it too.
And I do
driven mainly by Reformed Protestants, which is good.
I do know from accounts, historical and ones I've heard, that despite the oppression and the imprisonment and the persecution, there were a lot of underground Christians in Russia over the last 90, 100 years.
Oh yes, 100%. No, and the USSR and the not so democratic People's Republic of North Korea are the greatest evidences that Christianity can never be defeated. So North Korea is the perfect litmus test for this. There has never been a realm that has been so... The North Korea is more centralised than even the USSR, because the USSR was dealing with 22 million square kilometres. I mean, it was the third largest empire in the history of the world, basically, after the British and the Mongols. North Korea is a tiny territory, like it's not a big territory at all. And it's basically a glorified Tasmania in terms of territory. And so it's orders of magnitude, it's astronomically easier to centralise a government and to bring it under the iron fist of a divine dynasty that are the Kims, who are the literal gods the god kings of North Korea. It's also really only livable in like the southern half, because the northern half of North Korea is all very extremely cold mountains, which is where people get exiled to, and so for overwhelmingly at least, and so it's way easier to centralize when you really effectively have one city, Pyongyang, and even in North Korea, which is as the moniker commonly is referred to, the hermit kingdom, right, where there is cameras everywhere. Where there are secret police literally everywhere. Every single person is an informant on everyone else. There's no such thing as privacy. It doesn't exist, because in the privacy of your home, your own family members will report you to the regime. So there is no such thing as privacy doesn't exist in North Korea. Even there, Christianity has not been stamped out, and they've been running, and North Korea's been cracking on for 70-ish years, roughly speaking, since the late 1940s. So 70-ish, 75-ish years, roughly speaking, and Christianity, not only has Christianity not been stamped out, it's actually, as far as we can tell from the outside looking in, growing. To what degree, that's debatable, but it's not being stamped out, and it's not going to be. The West is still able to smuggle Bibles into North Korea, and the North Koreans haven't been able to stop it. Right. There's no defeating Jesus, and he's been undefeated for 2,000 years, and that's not going to end. And North Korea is the perfect litmus test for that, and even they can't do it. So I'd rather know which side I'd be on. And so let me finish this morning's passage because the last few verses felt pretty straightforward here. Verse 9 and following. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will lay a hand upon you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." So he's encouraging him in the face of significant opposition and persecution. Again, he's being heavily resisted. The blasphemy. We're not told that they'd been violent, but it may be possible that there'd been a number of scenarios where tensions had risen and like it had gotten Paul had probably had some close calls. You would imagine, like he's had in other cities. Well, more than close calls. He got stoned half to death in was it Derbe or Lystra? In Lystra, where he got beaten within an inch of his life, literally, and people thought he was actually dead. And so here he's saying, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent." Do not silence the truth because there is evil opposition. The only thing that can illuminate the dark is light. The only thing that can crush evil is good. The only thing that can reconcile chaos is order. You don't as to use the kind of the kind of parables that Christ spoke with, for example, and the kind of figures there. You don't bring light to the darkness by hiding your light under a bushel, by hiding it away, by covering up the candle, so it were, right? You don't illuminate a room by dimming the lights or by turning them off.
Clearly, you have to in North Korea.
Well, yes, exactly. Clearly, North Korea.
We have to use discernment. We have to use that. That's not what it means always. It means that sometimes.
Yes, there's discernment, and that's the point I was about to make, is that there's discernment of how it's done. But when it says, but in this context where he's not having to act in a clandestine or in a covert fashion, really is the word I'm looking for. Because there are instances where covert and clandestine needs to be the operating.
We've read about them in Acts.
Oh, correct. There have been times. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Christians in Damascus early on, when Paul and the squad were rolling up, they had to be operating covertly. They couldn't. In other words, they couldn't. So, overt is like what we're doing now. We're very overt. We're out in the public. We're open. We're not hiding anything. Covert is being covered. Hence the term covert. Being covert is being careful and hidden to a degree, and then clandestine is absolute. We're doing this in secrecy because one little error can cause someone to die, type of deal, and we can't let people know that we're operating at all. That's clandestine. So Christians in North Korea many times have to operate clandestinely. Sometimes it can be covert, but generally it has to be clandestine. But in instances like this, he doesn't have to be clandestine nor covert. In fact, he actually needs to be overt. and so Paul is being encouraged here by God. Do not fear. Right? Fear God, not man, which is one of the most ancient pieces of wisdom in the scriptures. Do not fear man, fear God. Do not be afraid. Right? Instead, be courageous. Go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you. Again, this is the exact kind of rhetoric which God spoke of routinely in the Old Testament. He's saying the same thing to Paul here, which he said to all the prophets. He's saying the same thing to Paul, which he said to the kings. He's saying the same thing that he said to David and to Moses and to Joshua and to Abraham and all the various people. And no man will lay a hand on you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. So he's encouraging him and saying, you've been getting, yeah, exactly, yeah, you've been getting hit by the waves here. Right, the seas are rough, so to speak, probably, but keep persevering, keep enduring, because I have many people, I have many elect in this city that are yet to convert, and they're my people.
It's interesting that it comes here though, because we've already passed Derbe and Lystra. He was killed, in my view. He was stoned to death.
Could have been, yeah.
And verse 9 comes after verse 8, which is an encouraging verse. It says
exactly, yeah.
7 and 8. And when he went from there, he entered the house of Titus, whose house was next door to the synagogue,
with Crispus
and the whole house believing in God. And many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and were being baptized. Yeah. And the Lord said,
and Crispus is a major victory, yeah.
Through a vision, you must not be afraid. It sounds there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, and the answer, the reconciled answer that I give for that is that in the face of these victories, it's tit for tat. Now, this is why I think Luke has structured it this way very cleverly, because those things, so the conversion of a prominent, wealthy Gentile, in this case, Titus Eustace, who now provides a base of operation and a church, a house church, because all the churches began in houses. That's the smallest, that's where they began, by necessity, of course, which ends right next door to the synagogue. And then God converts the leader of that synagogue. And that would be a major victory, quote unquote, if you want to think of it that way, right? These things are encouraging him, and yet at the same time, though, he's facing significant opposition in a city of great consequence, right? This is not. Here's how I tend to frame it. These things really should be viewed, and a lot of these places and these missionary journeys need to be thought of almost in like militaristic terms, not in terms of bloodshed and bullets and guns, or in this case swords and shields. What I mean is in terms of like territorial almost. Like just like he was in Athens, Luke really clearly sets up chapter 17 as like, this is really serious, right? Paul is about to have his mettle tested, so it were. And Paul's just about the only Christian alive at this point that could actually handle that scenario, which is why it was Paul, right? And not that Luke literally says that, but the way he writes and the way he establishes that chapter gives the picture of it, the almost like the theatre of it really plays that way. And here it's another kind of example of that. Corinth is a major city of serious consequence. And so that he's getting major opposition in Corinth because it's such a consequential city. Those who are evil and those who are forces or powers of darkness are wanting to make sure that Paul is definitely stamped out in a place like Corinth and a place like Athens, as opposed to how much resistance does he find in Verona? None. Right? Tiny little place.
He must have been afraid, Paul.
To an element, yeah, for sure. To an element. There would have been, and there would have been, because naturally, there should. It's not like he would have felt encouraged coming out of Athens, but he was getting his. That's not just because Paul's really talented doesn't mean there's not pressure. There's immense pressure, incredible pressure. You don't think how do you think like I'll use another comparable example in terms of just like circumstance at least. Martin Luther was a very, very intelligent man. He was a scholar. He was a PhD. He was a philosopher. He was a theologian. He was a professor at university. He was a PhD. He wasn't an idiot. No, he was very intelligent. All the reformers were. All the reformers were scholars. That's the whole point, right? They were all very, very intelligent men, and they're all in the height of the Renaissance as well. Keep in mind in the early 1500s, and so they were well educated in language. That's why the Reformation was so successful, because unlike many of their predecessors, guys like Luther and whatnot actually knew Greek. They actually knew the languages because of the Renaissance principle of ad fontes in Latin, which means back to the sources. Fontes, where we get the word fountain from. Back to the sources of the ancient world, where now they can actually read it. So they're very, very intelligent. But we know full well from Luther's diary, from other writings from Luther, that he's standing before the emperor. He's standing before, and not just any emperor, he's standing before Charles V, who's basically, Charles V of the Spanish Habsburgs is one of the most powerful emperors in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles V, one of the most notable emperors in the history of Europe. It was no joke. The consequences were super serious. His interlocutors, the lawyers for the empire, were extremely intelligent as well. Very, very bright jurisprudential minds. The level of the stakes of it, this is high level stuff in terms of the way that the world operated and things that mattered. And Luther rose to the challenge. But even when Luther was facing his trial, quote unquote, or at least his trial of his ideas at the Diet of Worms in 1521, he actually says, "Give me a day to prepare my..." he needs to go home and take 24 hours to actually think and work through these things. And so then he comes back with this famous speech, which you can always look up. But to paraphrase, he says that here I stand, I can do no other. God help me. that I must stand upon the word of God, not the false ideas of men's tradition, and so on and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Paul would be no different. Paul's also a human being. Paul's also a man. Paul's also mortal. And his intelligence and his intellectual genius can only carry him so far, because that you can only carry any man so far, in the face of difficulty, in the face of hatred, in the face of people hurling insult. And again, it's logical or reasonable to assume that there could have been multiple instances in which, a breakout of violence could have nearly happened, but it got avoided, because it's happened in other cities. So where they actually have gotten violent, where that's crossed over the line into full-blown violence against Paul and others. Did you have something?
When I look at it again, when I look at it more deeply, I don't think Paul was fearful for his life, because
I'm not talking on those lines,
he didn't care if he died. Because to him...
No, I'm talking on the consequence. That's why I mentioned the consequence. I wasn't talking about him personally. I was talking about the consequence of Corinth. That's what I mentioned earlier.
I think he's fearful. I think he's very frustrated, because he sees...
Oh, that's obvious. Yeah, sure.
He sees these intransigent synagogue congregants who, despite every argument, will not bend. They're stiff-necked.
Actually getting worse,
and
correct.
So I think he's fearful that his ministry is...
Failing.
Yeah.
No, and that's why I mentioned the consequence of Corinth. That's the light in which I was trying to paint it. Because there's not just the frustration element, but there's actually the element of failure. And no doubt, of course, again, when you think about the deeper, weightier things, of those either literally in person, or those who otherwise would have been other such powers who would have been, the proverbial whisper in the ear, so it were, of you're failing, you're a failure, this is not going to work, those kinds of influences. For him, it's the consequence of the mission in that city is the point that's trying to be made, because he is giving them, and that's the whole point you made. And it starts with the argumentative side, which is rightfully so. 18 months, he's laid out every possible argument that you could ever give, and to the point where it's self-evident at that point. Not literally self-evident, but by the time you get through it all, it's very clear and evident. Here's what the Old Testament says this Messiah, this Saviour would be, and here is how Jesus lined up perfectly with that. No one's ever lined up with it ever before, because of course they haven't, because he's actually the Messiah, and yet you still reject it. It's like showing you today that, here's the resurrection, here's how the resurrection happened, here's what the people who wrote about it said happened, here's what all the witnesses, here's all the evidence. We're coming down to, we're 2,000 years later, but we can look back at a historical source and go, wow, this actually did happen. Just like I can look back at a historical source like Caesar's Gallic Wars and see that Caesar actually did conquer Gaul, right? Well, of course he did, because I can look at the evidence and I can see that it actually happened. Just like I can see the evidence that Jesus clearly did rise from the dead, and that should be taken seriously and as consequential in the world, right? But to reject that is to actually reject the very concept of truth, because actually really what you're rejecting, ultimately, when an argument of any kind, even forgetting this for a second, of any kind, when an argument of any kind has been laid out fully and entirely, and has been, by any reasonable objective standard, shown to be valid and true, and you then reject it, like let's just take something like a mathematical proof, like you did a mathematical equation, you showed mathematically and here's the answer, and you show that logically in mathematics, and then a person goes, no, I don't believe that's the answer. You're actually not rejecting the mathematical equation at that point. You're actually just rejecting the very concept of logic or of truth. That's really what you would be doing. If someone seriously laid out the argument and demonstrated very obviously that the sun rises in the east, not the west, and you then rejected that, I know it's trivial, but take it with it for a second, and you then rejected that notion and went, no, it rises in the west. Well, now you're actually just rejecting the concept that anything can be true. Do you know what I mean? Philosophically, you're actually rejecting the notion of truth itself at that point. That's the whole point here.
I think on even deeper examination, I think what is going on is that there is a very significant turning point here. Paul, I think, is clearly grieving for his fellow Israelites,
his fellow countrymen. Yeah, sure.
He's he loves them so much that he just
Correct, yes.
prays that they all come into belief in Jesus Christ the Lord.
Yeah, 100%.
That's not going to happen. So it explains why the Lord appears to him in a vision and to encourage him.
Yeah.
And when the Lord says, for many of my people are in this city, he's not referring to the Israelites.
No.
They're the ones, the third that were going to be believers, they're already believers. He's now talking about the Gentiles.
Yeah, correct, 100%. Yes.
And the Lord is
because the plan's
saying
always been the
to
nations
Paul,
here.
don't worry, I've got my people in this city. They're not what you are expecting.
Yeah, correct.
They're not the Israelites that you dearly love and want to come into.
And rightfully so. His natural affection for his fellow countrymen is actually a good thing, and the Bible presents it as a good thing. At no point does it ever present his desire for particularly the conversion of his fellow Israelites as a bad thing, ever. It never presents it that way. Because love for your kin is consistently valued as a good thing, right? Because it's natural, it makes sense, right? Because kinship, K-I-N, kinship, and ethnicity is tied inherently to ancestry. That's the whole point, right? So my valuing, for example, let's just take it to someone like me, overwhelmingly Celtic ancestry, minority English, my valuing of people of British ancestry above others in that sense, at least in terms of like emotionally, makes perfect sense. Not to the denigration of others, but just simply to the elevation of this. The exact same goes the opposite way. I would be gravely concerned, like I'd be a bit worried if someone from West Africa placed this great value on the people of Western Europe, but then to the neglect of their own West African compatriots. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, no. You shouldn't do that because your fellow kin, your fellow countrymen, right? Someone needs to take care of, someone needs to be really concerned about the West Africans, and that should be you. Well, I know it goes all kinds of wacky ways in our modern world. Yeah, it's very weird sometimes. But the point I'm trying to make, and that's not to the neglect of the others, because here in this scenario, that's exactly the point that's being raised here, and that's the punchline of what God says. The basis of his encouragement is actually the punchline, which is the last sentence, or the last clause, for I have many people in this city. I have many people in this city. But who are they? Well, they're Greeks. They're Romans.
They're Greeks.
But they're my people. They're my people because the plan's always been the nations.
And I would then argue, and this is not my argument, it's one that just clearly flows from what we just read, that this is a turning point in where Paul realises that his mission now is the Gentile world mission.
This is the most obvious, yeah, that point can be taken that this is the most obvious demonstration of that. It's been going on, this is his second missionary journey, but this is the most obvious demonstration of that. It's a turning point's a good word, yeah. It's a defining turning point. Not just theologically, but like philosophically, in terms of the mission statement, quote unquote, if you want to think of it that way. And yeah, especially in a place like Corinth, which was very cosmopolitan anyway, in that kind of sense. Like, people from all around the empire were in Corinth.
Paul was...
It's the most cosmopolitan place he's visited, for sure.
He was a very tenacious character. Because if this is the second missionary journey, he was still pining and yearning for those Israelites.
Yeah, and rightly so, and rightly so, and fair enough, because that's a good and natural affection. They're his fellow countrymen, they're his kin, but the mission is greater than just them, and they've rejected. Yep, and that's and I'll leave it on this point, because basically then verse 11 says, and he stayed there a year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. That's Luke concluding. One of the most fascinating and somber and humbling portions of the Gospels is kind of along these lines. It's where Jesus encounters the rich young man, and he asks him, "What must I do to be saved? Effectively, what must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven?" And he gives him a spiel about how he's a very good moral man, and I'm good, and I do this, and I give money to this. And Jesus doesn't even bother to correct him on that necessarily, because there's actually a deeper issue at heart. Exactly. And he says, and so Jesus just simply gets to the heart of the issue and says to him, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, give away your riches. Not because Jesus was a communist, but because Jesus was actually putting his finger right on the very thing that was the source of his,
The raw nerve.
all of his, the raw nerve, all of his problems. His pride, his arrogance, his hubris,
The love of money.
all tied back to the fact that he essentially worshipped mammon, so to speak. He had a truly almost worshipful love of money. He loved that he was rich. So the ego, the pride, the arrogance, the hubris, anything else that comes from it was all tied back to his existential love for his wealth. And so Jesus says, not because in order to be saved, you actually have to give away everything you own. That's actually not what he's saying to you. No. He's actually making a very contextual point to that one man. Give away everything you own. In other words, place something of value higher than your wealth, namely God. And he doesn't do it. So what happens to the young rich man? He actually is disheartened, he's saddened, and walks away. And people tend to talk about that story as it is, but what's the most terrifying part of the story, most humbling and sober part of the story, is actually what's not said, which is the fact that the rich young man walks away, and then the gospel author just puts a full stop, and then the story moves on. And so what's not said is, and Jesus chased after him and said, exactly. Please, no, don't you understand? You need to... No.
No, he didn't.
The God of the universe watches this man walk away, and we never hear from him ever again.
Exactly. Mm.
You had you had your shot. You were standing before God incarnate,
yeah. And
you rejected and walked away, and he did not chase after you.
No.
Oh, and just the heaviness of that sets in. Is that because God... No. God doesn't owe you anything. God gave you life. God gave you breath. All that wealth you have, God gave you anyway. God owes you nothing. God doesn't owe you anything. And the fact that he then walks away and Jesus doesn't go chasing after him, going, no, please, just try me out. No. No. He lets him walk away. That's the humbling and somber part of it. And it is what it is. Because God doesn't owe any man. God doesn't owe any man anything, least of all salvation. He doesn't owe you salvation. He doesn't owe me it. No. That's why it's such a beautiful and gracious gift. That's why we celebrate it every single week. That's why we worship him for it. That's why we plead with our fellow man to come and turn to Christ, because he doesn't have to offer us salvation for anything. All we deserve is judgment and justice in the face of the evil and morally corrupt things that we have done in our lives. But yet he offers us salvation freely by his grace, because he has his people. So therein we end. Now, just so you're aware, I'll mention it in the announcements on Sunday, but I'm away over the next fortnight. So there's no Bible study next week, nor the week after. We come back in 3 weeks' time, but again, it'll be part of the announcements. Or if not, check your schedules anyway, because it's all in your schedules. So your church schedules, which you hopefully have. So thank you.